Despite what you've seen online, building cabinet doors isn't overly complicated, and I'm going to show you just how easy it can be by demonstrating 3 different options, from something more beginner to advanced using only DIY tools. And as a little bonus, we'll see if you can spot the differences between the 3 at the end of the video. For our basic beginner door, all you're going to need is a circular saw, sander, some clamps, a square, and some DIY grit and determination. We're making a shaker style because I like to fit in. So head to your local home center and buy some 1/2" and 1/4" MDF. They come in full sheets or these nice smaller panels that are much easier to deal with. Also, if you're going to be storing these panels for any length of time, even if it's overnight, keep them laying flat on something that's actually flat because, like me, they're very frail and can barely support their own body weight when standing up. Now, if you don't have space for all this, you can lean it against the wall, but make sure you're doing that on the long edge, not the top or the bottom. Otherwise, these things will warp on you pretty quickly. Since I'm doing an overlay style door, it's as simple as measuring in both directions, taking the width and then the height, and adding 1 inch, and that will give me a 1/2" overlay all the way around. The thicker 1/2" MDF will be my base piece, which means it needs to be cut to the appropriate size. Now, factory edges on MDF, especially those from a home center, have generally been through a war, so it's best to remove that first. And notice I'm using the 1/4" piece as a guide rail to keep the cut nice and straight. After a quick rehab session, we're left with a crisp edge, and just to be sure, make sure you mark it so you don't lose track of everything. Before you remove the makeshift fence, you want to make sure that you measure this distance right here, because that's the offset of the base plate to the edge of your saw blade. And mine is 3 9/16. So I can take that and add it to the final width of the cabinet door, which was 15 1/16, and that gives me 18 10/16, which is I think 18 5/8. Also, save it metric people. We get it. This is ridiculous. We put a man on the moon, okay? Doesn't matter if we use metric to do it. We put a man on the moon. All right, so I can measure and mark from both ends of that 1/2" sheet and then align the 1/4" panel, aka our de facto fence, and get to cutting. I like to use these foam insulation boards to protect my workbench and then give me something to cut into. It also raises the workpiece up so I can get the clamps underneath. And be sure to keep your eyes on the fence, not the blade, to ensure the saw doesn't wander away. If I were making multiple doors that were the same size, instead of cutting the shorter width here, I would have cut along the length so I could get a BOGO deal with 2 or 3 additional panels instead of just 1. Anyways, this has 2 parallel edges, but the ends are not square. To remedy that situation, I'll first establish a new cut using a square to make everything nice at 90 degrees. And you do want to take some extra time here double checking your setup. Now, we're going to talk all about tools throughout this video, but you can build most things with a circular saw. It just takes longer. Hence why you see us using other tools in videos. We like to move fast, but don't let tools be an excuse for not getting something done. So I'm then measuring the opposing side and making another cut, which establishes the final height. But congratulations, you now have a bunch of smushed up sawdust mixed with glue in a randomly sized rectangle. Give yourself a nice pat on the back. Before going forward, it is good practice to double check that your base piece is the appropriate size and will fit into the cabinet. Not that I would ever cut anything too big or small. I also like to take a look at the diagonals, and what this does is ensure that your piece is square, and these 2 measurements should be nearly identical. If they're within a 1/16 of an inch, you're totally fine. Anything more and I would go back and recut it. This is looking good, which means we can cut some thin strips out of the 1/4" MDF behind me to act as our faux rails and stiles. Rails and stiles are generally between 2 to 2.5 inches wide. Anything more than that and you're just Cybertruck overcompensating. Mine are going to be 2 inches to match some existing doors. To make the cut, I'm using this rip guide that attaches to a circular saw. I'm not going to tell you that it's perfect. In fact, I think the straight edge trick that I was showing is more accurate, but I'm all about giving you different ways to get it done. If you're new to all this and you want to fit in with the cool kids lingo, stiles are the vertical pieces on a door and then rails are the horizontal. I'm going to start with getting my stiles to their finished size, which is just the height of the door. I'm doing these at the same time, also known as batch cutting, and I'm employing the help of this crosscut sled that I made for my circular saw. Now, you don't need one of these, but I'm finding it super helpful for operations like this. Good news for you, if you want to build your own, I created a free set of plans and there's a link in the description below. Look, I'm doing my best here, people, trying to help out. However, I'm sure someone will still complain that a circular saw with free plans is not beginner DIY. And to that, I say GFY. Nonetheless, with the stiles temporarily in place, I can measure that opening for my rails and set up a stop block on the crosscut sled to cut them to size. This was just barely too long after my first cut and needed a second trim of about a 32nd of an inch. For situations like this, I find these plastic handy shims are perfect and they come in color-coded nominal dimensions. But that fits just right. And now the most important part, gluing these into place. But before I do that, I'm going to draw a line all the way around the perimeter of my piece, and that's to serve as a Gandalf thou shalt not pass mark while I'm actually spreading the glue around. A little Lord of the Rings reference for the kids at home. Now, MDF is like a sponge because it's, well, a bunch of compressed sawdust, so don't be stingy with the glue. A bit of tape and then a board over the top with some weights will be more than enough to hold it in place while the glue dries, or you can pop some brad nails in and then cover those up with wood filler. If you're just doing the weights after an hour or so, it's more than dry enough, so don't bother waiting until the next day if you want to keep on moving. A general rule of thumb when you're prepping something for finish, if you can see it, you're going to be able to feel it even after paint. That probably didn't make much sense in hindsight. What I'm trying to say is, if you have a joint and you can feel that joint, like where the 1/2 inch and the 1/4 inch meet here, it's not going to disappear. Luckily, some wood filler will help smooth things out. Now you might be saying, that seems like a bit more work than I want to do if I had 20 doors to make. And guess what? You are absolutely right. It's a lot of work. No one said DIY was easy, and generally, the most basic version of DIY with the least amount of tools requires the most effort. Shocker. However, a major pro for this method is you can make these doors super cheap and save yourself a ton of money. If you're building these for a bathroom though, I might be a little hesitant to only use MDF because moisture is its weakness. Then again, the paint will seal it up. Another con is the overall durability of MDF. It's soft and dense and dings easily. If that concerns you because you have a gang of domestic terrorists running around your house like I do, I think you're gonna like our next option. But that is a wrap for this one. Let's move on to door number 2. And if you're worried about how to actually paint and install the hinges, don't worry, I'll cover that at the end of the video for all 3 at the same time. All right, let's call this our intermediate version. And to build it, you're going to need a circular or a miter saw, either one doesn't matter, a router with a rabbiting bit, sander, a square, and then optionally something to drill in pocket holes. Again, emphasis on optional, don't panic just yet. As far as what to buy, get some 1/2 inch MDF and a 1x3, and all these materials are readily available at a home center. Just make sure to take a little time finding the flattest and straightest version of each, which is a bit of a treasure hunt sometimes. First step is going to be cutting these stiles to the height of the door. And just like with option 1, these are 1/2 inch overlays, so I added an inch to the height of the door opening. You've already seen me show how to make this exact cut on a circular saw, so don't panic if you're miter sawless. Simple crosscuts, people. Getting the rails to the correct size is as simple as positioning a stop block to the final width of the door, plus 1 inch for the overlay, and then placing 2 offcuts in between the stop and the blade to account for the stile width. All right, now we need to get our woodworking on and connect these 4 pieces together. As promised, pocket holes are going to be optional. To demonstrate what I'm talking about, I'm going to, optionally, drill pocket holes in only one of the 2 rail pieces. Also, you don't need a tricked out pocket hole jig like this one. The basic version gets the job done all the same, just a little slower. All right, time to put this all together, and it's pretty straightforward and easy. On one side, we'll be using the glue and screw, and then on the other side, it's going to be glue only. Oh, that's pretty confusing now that I say it out loud. Let me explain, hold on a second. A joint with screws and glue like this one is really strong. You're not breaking it in normal door use. Also, be sure to clamp the board to a bench. They wiggle while sinking in pocket screws. As I was saying, this is beefy, like high quality Angus stuff here. On the opposing side, with an end grain to edge grain joint using glue only, it's strongish, but beefy is not how I would describe it. More like beyond beef. However, once we take care of the back panel, our weak vegan joint will be super jacked. So I'm gonna let this dry for an hour or so and then we can keep going. Time for this door to take some anabolic steroids in the form of a 1/2 inch rabbiting bit. Now that I have this properly installed in my router, I'm setting the depth, so we're taking about 1/8 of an inch pass. Always take shallow passes with your router, If you risk it and try to hog away all the material in 1 or 2 passes, you're gonna have a bad time. You know what else is a bad time? Spam calls, non-stop spam calls. So if you're someone like me that takes multiple passes with the router and not a maniac, I think you should check out Incogni. The problem is online data brokers sell your information to businesses and marketing agencies, and then you're never left alone. And it feels like it's only getting worse these days. Even if your phone is safe, they find a way to blow up your email inbox. Thankfully, all it takes is requesting your information to be removed from those data brokers, but there are hundreds upon hundreds, and that's where Incogni comes in. After signing up for their friends and family plan, which covers you and 4 other family members, they reach out to those brokers and get your information removed, then the calls stop. Without going into too many details, a couple years ago, some wacko got a hold of my phone number and left voicemail threatening lawsuits. Never said this wasn't messy, by the way. The first thing I did was hire them to scrub my information, and it's not just spam calls and annoying voicemails. Your information can easily be used to steal your identity and open bank accounts, take out loans, which is the last thing you want to be dealing with. So take your personal data back with Incogni and use code LINCOLN at the link below, which gets you 60% off an annual plan. And a big thanks to Incogni for sponsoring today's video. All right, I've made 3 passes. I am going to take a 4th to get to my final depth. I'm using this scrap piece of 1/2" MDF to set the bit to the proper height so that the back panel will sit flush with the rails and stiles. You can also see why I drilled my pocket holes far away from the inside edge. Now, I never claimed that this version of doors was the fastest to make, and I'll cover the pros and cons in a moment, but the nice thing is, unlike our beginner door, you get a little more oomph with wood rails and stiles instead of MDF. Even though this wood is borderline vegan, it's better than sawdust. A quick measurement of this rabbet, and then I can cut the 1/2" sheet of MDF to size for this panel. You might be asking if a 1/4" MDF would be okay for the back panel. Short answer, yes. Long answer, I don't personally love the look of the 1/4" being inset so far back from the front of the rails and stiles. It looks cheap to me. Plus, it's nice having a door with a little more heft and gravitas. Unfortunately, we're now at an impasse, and it's a tale as old as time, the square panel in the round rabbet situation. And one of these has to give, so you can either chisel off these corners and make this 90 degrees, or you can round off your panel corners to match the radius of the rabbet. It's up to you. There's no right or wrong answer. As for me, I'm a simple man and like the path of least resistance, so I'm just gonna nip the bulk off with the circular saw and then round these with a random orbital sander. But again, this is all personal preference. If you're making a drawer face instead of a door, it's likely the back will never even be seen, so keep that in mind. Putting a bow on our pocket holes versus no pocket holes conversation, by gluing this panel into place along the inside of our rabbet, most importantly on that corner where the rails and stiles meet, this joint now has a spline reinforcing it. And without getting too technical with the woodworking mumbo jumbo, that turns Beyond Beef into super jacked Angus, plus some. So if you'd like an insurance policy, by all means, add screws. If not, you will be fine as is. I know a lot of people take pride in creating something that will last 200 years. Quite honestly, once I'm dead, I don't really care, and it's likely these will be in a landfill in 20 years anyways when my wife has me redo them. It shouldn't take much other than tape to hold this panel in place here. Mine's pretty snug. It's a good idea to double check that you had no glue squeeze out on the front. I was sure to make sure to keep the glue on the inside part of the rabbet, not the outside part, but this looks good. While this dries, I'm going to fill in the pocket holes, then hit the joint between the back panel and the rails and stiles with some wood fillers, and this is pretty close to good to go. Also, if you're completely new to woodworking and this all sounds fun and exciting, I recently released a course with a couple buddies called The Best Beginner Woodworking Course, period. And it's everything we wish we had starting out, so check out the link below if this interests you. Some quick pros and cons for our intermediate door. On the plus side, you don't need any fancy equipment, and no, a router is pretty basic, people. These are reasonably cheap to make, plus wood rails and stiles will offer a little more durability. But on the cons, they aren't the fastest door to make, and if you want to impress the dishes in your cabinet, you will need to spend a little time on the rabbet in the back panel if it doesn't suit your fancy as is. But speaking of fancy, we're going to make something really professional looking for door number 3. Time to do it. I hope most of you are picking up on the underlying theme of this video, and that is, like most things in woodworking, there are always multiple ways to get things done. Speaking of, to build our advanced door, you're going to need a table saw, sander, and some clamps. You can buy 3/4 inch hardwood like this poplar from home centers or a specialty lumber dealer, and then rip it down to the appropriate size for your rails and stiles. As far as what wood you want to use, like I said, I'm using poplar because it's cheap and it paints like a dream. However, it's not terribly durable. If the running of the bulls is a daily occurrence in your house, pay a bit more and upgrade to maple. Now this is all paint grade advice, by the way. Figuring out your stile height is the exact same, just the height of the door, and don't forget to account for the overlay on the top and the bottom. Now as for the rails, there is a bit more math involved, so I'm going to make my 3rd grade teacher proud and show you my work on screen. My finished door width is 16 inches, but just like the first 2 doors, I need to subtract 2 times the stile width. 16 minus 4 equals 12. However, this time we need to add back 1 inch to account for our groove depth. And that brings our final width to 13 inches. Told you I could do it, Miss Marchetti. I've talked about this in other videos, however, I've recently decided it's a hill I'm willing to die on, and I know I'm speaking to the lowest common denominator here, so maybe that makes me the idiot. Nonetheless, if you're watching this and you have aspirations of building your own doors or making other furniture, you need tools for that. So don't come to a video with the expectation that I or other creators are going to show you how to make something with just hopes and dreams. It doesn't work like that. If you're tight on cash like I was starting out, buy used. Contrary to what dummies post in the comment section, you do not need $20,000 worth of tools to do this. And I think I've shown throughout this video that you can do a lot with very little. I have the parts cut to size for my rails and stiles. Now, if you're making multiple doors at the same time, please label everything so you don't lose track. I do need to cut a groove in all 4 of these parts, so let me show you how easy that is to set everything up. For starters, I'm using a flat top blade. Flat tops leave a nice flat bottom, not to be confused with the fat bottom for all the Queen fans out there, versus the W shape from an ATB, and we do not want that. Now I can set the blade height to 1/2 inch using my combination square. This is made by PEC, by the way. I always get questions when I show it. They're made in the USA and super high quality. I have a link below. Next, position the fence so that the center of the blade is as close as you can get it to the center of your rail and stile. It doesn't need to be bang on, just get it as close as you can. Now all the parts can be run through the table saw. I do like to verify that the groove is actually 1/2 inch deep on my test piece first. And as you're doing this, it's important to apply pressure down and against the fence simultaneously. A featherboard can help, but it's not a requirement. And just go slow, and if you're batching out a lot of parts, don't lose focus because that's when accidents happen. All right, an initial cut has been made on all of our parts, plus the test piece. Now we can just position the fence so that the groove will end up the perfect width to accept the center panel. Just barely bump the fence towards the blade and take a pass using the test piece. But you need to flip the board around 180 degrees and run it through again. And this will perfectly center the groove on the piece. This looks to be just barely too wide right now, so I'm gonna have to make one more adjustment, tapping the fence over. And remember, any adjustment you make is effectively doubled because you're cutting the board twice, so keep that in mind when you're making your adjustments. Fine tune it, as they say. I think you can see why having a test piece is so important. If I had moved that fence over too much and the groove became too wide, it wouldn't ruin an actual part. Now, as far as the fit, you don't want anything too tight, especially MDF, because it will swell when glue is applied, but don't get it too loose either and have this floppy panel. Bit of a Goldilocks and the Three Bears situation. My test piece looks just about perfect, so I'm gonna run all the parts through and making sure to do a flip on each one. And I'm sure that people are asking if it's okay to use plywood instead of MDF for the center panel, and I'll cover that after this next step because that is a fair question. Excellent news, we now have rails and stiles and a test piece with a perfectly centered groove. However, we do need a way to connect these together, and the easiest way to do that is with a tenon tongue thing. I'm actually not sure if it's called a tenon or a tongue in this situation. Someone let me know down below. First things first, lower the blade height to just a smidgen below the height of the groove. And remember, a smidgen is a very standardized measurement. Then use a combination square to set the fence so the outside of your blade, not the inside, matches the depth of your groove. Mine is 1/2 inch. All right, so that's all set, and now we can make some test cuts. I do have a miter gauge with a scrap piece of wood to support the workpiece and reduce tear out. So I'm starting on the edge and then working my way over until I make contact with the fence. And since this is not a through cut, you're okay using the fence with a miter gauge here. If this were a through cut, it's a big no-no. Don't do it. Once you have one side done, you can flip it over and then repeat the same steps. You might notice me moving the piece across the blade. Again, another thing that looks unsafe, but it's okay. And this motion will get your tenon piece all JB smooth on both sides. If your tenon piece does not fit in the groove after the first try, and it shouldn't because you were precisely a smidgen too low, barely raise the blade and shave everything off on both sides. Unfortunately, there is no mathematical formula for determining the numerical difference between a smidgen and a barely, so that one's up to you. All right, time for a fit check. You're looking for something not too tight, not too loose. Friction fit is all you need. That's pretty good right there. And some troubleshooting tips here. If you're putting this in and the tenon is too short and you're not bottoming it all the way out in the groove, that means your tenon is not long enough. So move the fence away. And if you're having the opposite problem, move your fence a little bit closer. Now that everything's dialed in, I'm going to cut the tenons on my actual style pieces. And while I do that, it's the perfect opportunity to anticipate some of the not so bright comments this video will get. Yes, I am fully aware that they make router bits that replicate the same results faster. However, my channel has now received over 50,000 comments, and I've read every single one of them. And from those comments, I know the beginners in my audience are much more likely to have a table saw before a router table. So I felt it would be helpful to show them how to get it done like this. And if you have a problem with that, I refer you back to this earlier timestamp in the video. I have my rails and stiles ready to go, which means I can temporarily put this together and then measure the dimension for my inner panel. But remember, you need to show your work to get full credit with Miss Marchetti. This door has an interior height of 16 3/8 and a width of 12 1/16. However, we don't want that panel to be perfectly snug, so let's subtract 1/8 of an inch in both directions, and that'll give us some wiggle room while we're assembling everything together. Now it's as simple as cutting your panel material to size. As promised, let's talk about plywood versus MDF. If you're painting the doors, go for MDF all the way. It's nice and stable, plus it paints much better than the plywood. If it's a stained grade door, use plywood that matches the species of your rails and stiles. Keeping the elementary school theme going, time for a little show and tell. When I insert this 1/4 inch panel into the groove, you'll notice that there is a 1/4 inch reveal on the rails and stiles on both the front and the back. Now, if you're doing a door, that's perfectly acceptable. In fact, that's very standard. However, if this were a drawer face, you'd want the back panel to be even with the rails and stiles, and that would allow it to sit perfectly flush on the face of the drawer front box, just like you had with our first two doors in the beginner and the intermediate. But we need a 1/2 inch center panel to do that. I cut this to size earlier with the 1/4 inch panel, and obviously the 1/2 inch is not going to fit the groove that we have, which means this needs a rabbet along all 4 sides. Now, typically this is done with a dado stack, but in the interest of keeping this basic, let's use a standard table saw blade. I'm setting the height to just barely less than 1/2 an inch, and if you're not comfortable with running this through the table saw on edge, adding an auxiliary high fence like this will make the cut much more stable. And just like when we use the fence with the miter gauge, this is a non-through cut, so the risk is pretty low in terms of things going wrong. Just keep it nice and stable with both hands and go slow. Also, credit where credit is due. I saw Senor Stumpy show how to make this cut years ago. And just like cutting the groove in the rails and stiles, this is going to take multiple passes, just barely bumping the fence towards the blade until you have a 1/4 inch rabbet. Again, much faster with a dado stack or a router table, and I'm aware that those tools exist, but this is all about showing different ways to get something done. For the assembly, I'm going to be demonstrating on a 1/4 inch panel. Now, if you want to use the 1/2 inch with the rabbet, it is the exact same thing. But as of 10 seconds ago, I decided that there are 100% more doors than drawers in the world. What do you think? It's a good new debate, huh? More doors or drawers? It's got to be more doors. While you sit there mulling that over, let me fill you in on another great woodworking debate, and that is to glue in the center panel or let it float. Unfortunately, logic is often thrown out the window and the internet overcomplicates something simple, but it's as easy as this. If you're using a solid wood center panel, let it float and only apply glue to the tenons. And the reason is this: solid wood panels need room to expand and contract. When you glue them in, that doesn't allow it to happen and it's eventually going to crack. For plywood and MDF center panels, glue the entire thing into place because they don't change seasonally like a solid wood and don't need room to expand and contract. And also, you don't need to panic because the solid wood rails and stiles can still expand outward when the center panel is glued in, and since they're such narrow pieces, they aren't going to be moving much anyways. Some quick pros and cons. If you're batching out a lot of doors, this is reasonably fast, and it's a sturdy way to make doors that will be resilient thanks to the hardwood rails and stiles. On the con side, they require some fussing during setup, and you do need a table saw unlike the first two options. Some people like to wait until after painting to drill out their hinge locations. I prefer to do it before. That's because if anything catastrophic happens, you don't waste all the time painting something that needs to be fixed. I've shown this jig whenever I do doors, but it's a solid 10 out of 10 if you plan on using Euro-style hinges with any regularity. After that's done, also a good idea to do a test install on your cabinet before the final prep. Again, not mandatory, but if you've never built and installed cabinet doors before, it's a good idea to get your practice in now. And there you have it, our advanced door using just the table saw. And as a reminder, at the end of the video, I'm going to give you a test to see if you can spot the differences between the three after I get paint on them. Slight change of plans. I was going to give you some tips and tricks on painting these doors, but then I thought, what the hell am I going to teach you about painting? I suck at it, so much so that I normally contract this out. Instead, here's a Clip Notes version of the steps that I took. Before painting, I used wood filler on any joints and sanded using 180 grit. Thankfully, the weather was cooperating and I didn't need to turn the garage into a scene from Dexter like I did a couple weeks ago. I put one coat of water-based primer on everything. Actually, hold on, that's not right. I put 2 coats of primer on the MDF edges, 1 coat on everything else. Now, I bought this sprayer specifically for this project. In my official review, it doesn't seem professional quality, but it's more than good enough for DIY. And then I sanded and caulked the inside joint. And yes, you can caulk, the panel isn't moving. And finally, I sprayed 2 coats of this Sherwin-Williams Emerald Urethane Trim Enamel, making sure to sand in between coats. If you want actual painting tips, please watch Actual Painting Pros, not this dummy. But I will say the end results were not too shabby. Also, here's a great example of why I like caulking the inside joint. Same door, I only did the front, did not do the back, and you can see pretty significant difference between the two with the final look. So which one of these is my preferred method? If I'm making a lot of doors, the table saw with the traditional tongue and groove does take time to get things set up, but it's faster after. If I were only building a couple doors, I really like the beginner method with only MDF, but it does take some extra work to get the edges nice and smooth looking. So the real question is, can you pick out the beginner, intermediate, and advanced door from these three? And if you're sitting there saying to yourself, well, it's really tough because you painted them and now they all look the same. Congratulations on finally figuring out the entire point of the video. And that is, there are always multiple ways to get things done. Even with very limited tools, you can build what I consider to be very professional looking cabinet doors. So let me know in the comments below which one is which. As for me, I'm going to go celebrate finally finishing my laundry room after 14 months. We'll see ya.